It had been one of those days, too long, too tiring, the kind that made you wish for peace at the end of it. I'd just gotten home from a grueling meeting and wasn't expecting anyone to be around. My stepson, Mark, was supposed to be at his friend's house. I hadn't heard anything different, so I figured I'd have the house to myself for a while. A rare luxury. I entered the hallway, kicking off my shoes as I let out a long sigh, stretching my arms overhead. It felt good to be home. The quiet was comforting. I made my way toward the kitchen, thinking of a hot cup of tea to unwind. But as I passed Mark's room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I didn't think much of it at first. He often left it that way, but I still knocked gently as I stepped forward. "Mark? You in there?" I called out, half expecting the usual response of him being absorbed in his phone or video games. No reply. Curious, I pushed the door open just a little wider, planning to remind him about leaving the door closed if he was going to have some privacy. But what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Mark wasn't alone. And he wasn't exactly in the position I'd expected. He was standing by his dresser, but the room was filled with an unexpected sense of rawness that made me feel like I shouldn't have been there. It was as if I'd intruded into something private, something personal. My breath caught in my throat as I stared for a moment too long, realizing I was looking at something I hadn't prepared myself for. Something far different than I had ever expected. He was taller now, no longer the boy I remembered from just a few years ago, but someone completely different. And my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I quickly looked away, feeling the heat rise in my face. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't quite make my legs move. I had meant to apologize for the intrusion, but the words caught in my throat, unsure if I should say anything at all. "Sorry," I managed to say, my voice almost a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I just thought you were at your friend's house." I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, wondering if I'd done the right thing by acknowledging the awkwardness. Then, I quickly retreated, shutting the door behind me. The house felt suddenly too large, and the quiet seemed heavier now. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. What was it that had left me so flustered? It wasn't just the surprise, it was more than that. There was something else, something that stirred within me, but I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. I stood there in the hallway for a few moments, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what I had expected, but it certainly wasn't that. I had walked in on him, yes. But I had walked in on something far more intimate than I could have prepared myself for. A realization of how much things had changed, how much he had changed. I couldn't stay frozen there forever, though. I forced myself to move toward the kitchen, but every step felt heavier. I was unsure of what to do, what to feel, or how to act. Had I just violated his privacy? Was it something I should have simply ignored and moved past? I didn't know. All I knew was that I could never forget what I had just seen. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the tea kettle like it might have the answers to the storm of thoughts swirling in my head. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the mug, the warmth of the porcelain offering no comfort. What had just happened? What was I even feeling right now? It wasn't just the shock of walking in on him, though that was certainly part of it. It was this strange mix of emotions I couldn't place. I didn't know what was worse, seeing something so private and personal, or realizing that I had noticed things about him I hadn't before. He had always been my stepson, but now there was a growing awareness of the man he was becoming, and it was almost like I wasn't ready for it. I couldn't get the image out of my mind. The way he had stood there, so much more mature than I remembered, so different. It wasn't just the fact that he had clearly grown into his own. It was how I had reacted. Why had I stood there for so long? I had always prided myself on being a reasonable, calm person, but in that moment, I had lost my sense of control. It had felt like everything had frozen. I took a sip of the tea, the hot liquid doing little to settle my nerves. Was I overthinking this? Was it really that big of a deal? I was an adult, after all. He was growing up. Why should I feel so uncomfortable? But the truth was, I didn't know how to feel. I couldn't erase the image from my mind. I wasn't sure if I should go back and apologize, act like nothing happened, or have some kind of awkward conversation with him. What was the right move here? What did he think of me now? As I leaned against the counter, I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly set my mug down, preparing myself for whatever was about to come. Was he going to confront me? Apologize? Was he even embarrassed? I didn't know what I expected when he appeared in the kitchen, but it certainly wasn't the look on his face. He didn't seem angry or even upset, just hesitant. He stood by the door for a moment, his posture stiff, but there was something softer in his eyes. Something that made my heart race in a way I couldn't explain. "I'm sorry about before," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I didn't think anyone would be home." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. "It's okay, Mark," I said finally, keeping my tone even. "I shouldn't have barged in like that. I didn't mean to make things awkward." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing down at the floor for a moment before looking up at me. There was a slight redness to his cheeks, and I could tell that he was struggling with the same discomfort I was. "It's just, I've been growing up, you know," he said, a little quieter now. "It's weird. I didn't expect you to see me like that." I exhaled, letting some of the tension leave my shoulders. He was being open, and somehow, that made everything feel even more complicated. I didn't expect it either, I admitted, feeling a little embarrassed now. But I guess we're both just adjusting to things. "You've grown up." "I get that." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling between us. I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew I couldn't ignore the change happening. It was inevitable. He wasn't the little boy I remembered, and I wasn't the person who had been used to seeing him that way. I needed to accept that. "I guess. I'm just trying to figure out how to deal with all of this," I said, not entirely sure I was making sense. "Everything's changing. You're changing." Mark didn't say anything for a long moment, and I wondered if he had understood what I meant, or if he had a different perspective on it all. But then, finally, he spoke. "I'm still the same person, you know," he said quietly. "I'm still your stepson. I guess I just want things to feel normal again." Normal. I hadn't realized how much I had been craving that. A sense of stability, of balance. But normal was different now. Nothing was quite as simple as it had been before. "I understand," I said softly, finally meeting his gaze. "We'll figure it out." There was something in the way he looked at me then, a quiet understanding, as if we both knew things couldn't go back to the way they were. But somehow, that wasn't the worst thing. We had to move forward, acknowledging the changes we had both experienced. "I guess I should head to my friend's house after all," he said, breaking the silence, a tentative smile on his face. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. This was the first step, just acknowledging the shift. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. "I'll see you later, Mark," I said with a small, encouraging smile. As he walked out the door, I leaned back against the counter, breathing deeply. My heart was still racing, but the knot in my stomach had loosened. Things had changed, and they would continue to. But maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Life wasn't about staying the same. It was about figuring out how to move through the shifts, how to handle the uncomfortable moments and keep going. And somehow, we would both find our way through this. Together.